Yeah, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the work that I did as a PhD student at Monash University in Melbourne over the past years. And already I apologize if it's a little bit too information heavy maybe. This is something that academics tend to do, so I'm happy to answer any questions as well. Before I start, just want to ask how many people here are involved in the placement planning for WSUD systems? Quite a number. And how many of you have thought after placing a system somewhere, maybe this wasn't the right place or the right system for this place? Yeah? Right. Well, you're in the right place here then. So, let's get started. What does this work?
She's the last one, actually.
That's not my question.
And just use that.
All right, so before, so this is work that I did for my PhD, which led to the development of a spatial suitability mapping tool for WSUD systems. And before I'll show you what the tool does, I'll first explain a little bit about the reason why we started developing this tool. So, yeah, as all of you have been involved in over the past decades, we've started to implement a lot of these green urban stormwater management systems, or WSUDs as we call them here. And, well, leads to a lot of pretty pictures like these ones. But is it actually this pretty? So the first thing I did is I went to Flown a lot. I don't know if you were at this presentation of this lady yesterday. Her name was Alexa, I think. Yeah. She explained the concept of learning from failure. So this is essentially what I did. I tried to talk to as many practitioners as I could, so I kind of got a feeling for the problems that they were having. So I talked, this was all in Melbourne, I talked to engineering consultants, and I talked to municipalities, I talked to state governments, and Melbourne Water, and utilities. And yeah, so this was done through interviews, document reviews, workshops. And what I found is actually very similar to what Peter at the beginning of this session also found as well. Collaboration is very important for WSUD planning to not fail. And where there's no collaboration, it generally fails. Where there is collaboration, there's a much higher success rate. There's a lot of opportunistic and ad hoc planning. For example, implementing WSUD wherever roadworks are happening tends to be very popular because it's obviously quite cheap then. The presence or absence of local strategies seems to be very important. So if there's good local strategies and policies in place, that really helps proper planning and implementation. And it is important in order to attract funding, it's important to have a good business case. And this is very difficult for WSUD because a lot of the benefits are not financially measurable. So I took all this on board, and then I started looking at, okay, so what have we been doing so far? And I was really lucky that in Melbourne there's a database that I could work with and also kept on developing from Melbourne Water that has all the systems, all the WSUD systems. This is from 2012. So I could do some analysis in looking where are the systems right now. And what we see is, okay, so at this point there were 2,000 systems in this database. You can see here on the map how they're scattered around. And these are the sizes, the average sizes of the different systems. Obviously wetlands are the biggest, and boxes and pits are the smallest. So 2,000 systems, and the three biggest system types were wetlands with about 27%, 30% were lakes and ponds, and 30% rain gardens in terms of numbers. If you multiply those numbers with their size, you get the land uptake of the systems, total land uptake. Total land uptake, then wetlands are very dominant, obviously, because they're big systems. So about 63% of all those systems land uptake in Melbourne was wetlands, and a much smaller percentage was rain gardens. Because they're much smaller and more efficient systems. And then I also looked at the service area. So in total, these systems together service about 55,000 hectares, 65% of which was serviced by wetlands. All right, so now looking at where are these systems? Right, so we looked at, for example, the distance of these systems to natural waterways. And in order for these systems to be very effective, you want them to be like capturing the water as soon as it falls and not getting to waterways. So they actually tend to be close to waterways generally, which might not be optimal. You can see also in some areas it's very obvious that they kind of follow the waterways. Also, they tend to be placed on low slopes, which makes a lot of sense because it's easier to put a system where there's no slopes. You don't have to do any ground leveling, so that makes sense. So far, no real surprises. This is a little bit of a complex figure, and if you're interested, I can explain the details later. But this is relating the systems to the land uses. So which land uses do we find more systems, which land uses do we find less? Unsurprisingly, floodways we find a lot of systems. But I want to focus into streetscapes because, as we saw from the interviews that I did with councils before, is that I heard that they tend to implement these systems wherever there's roadworks. And you can actually see that back in the data because if you look here, about 6% of Melbourne is streetscapes, but 21% of the systems are found in this 6% of the land. So there's a heavy overrepresentation of systems in streetscapes. I'm not saying if that's a bad or a good thing, but it's a very clear trend. So then I looked at something more esoteric, as I heard another presenter say yesterday as well, but important nevertheless, which is socioeconomic kind of factors. And I found actually that I made circles around the center of Melbourne and related the amount of WSUD to the distance to the city center, and you find that the further away, generally, you are from the city center, the more WSUD there is, which makes sense because it's newer areas, there's more space. The exception actually is inner city Melbourne because that doesn't follow that trend. And a lot of socioeconomics factors are also related to distance to city center, as you can see. In all these graphs, population density decreases, house price decreases, education level actually decreases, environmental awareness decreases with distance to city center. And that means that also the amount of WSUD varies with all these factors as well. And this is obviously not intentional, it's an unintentional effect of the way how we plan WSUD. So, it is indeed, as the data also shows, and as the practitioners say, it's quite ad hoc. And it leads to unintended outcomes that may or not be good. So, what are we going to do about that? And that's where the development of this model came in. So we, is my professor Anna Delatic, Dr. Peter Bach, who's now in Switzerland, and Dr. Diego Ramirez, who's still at Monash. So we started the development of what we called the Spatial Suitability Analysis tool, SSANTO. And it's the basis behind this tool is basically a suitability framework that I've done an extensive literature review, looked at all the factors that are important for the placement of these systems. And I basically found that there's two main categories. One is the opportunities, where is the environment friendly to the placement of these systems, and where do we need all these extra benefits that we know these systems can bring us. So biophysical factors for the first category. Biophysical factors are the obvious one that most people take into consideration: soil, slope, hydrology, etc. Socioeconomics, usually not taken into account. And planning and governance factors, such as land availability, land price, ownership, these kind of things. And then on the need side, we actually just used a framework that already exists, which is the Ecosystem Services framework. It's adopted by the United Nations, which has 4 categories in it: provisioning. In terms of WSUD, that's mainly freshwater provisioning that we can use, like recycled rainwater. Regulating, which is the main purpose of WSUD, water regulation, water purification, water flow regulation, but also climate regulation, microclimate regulation, urban heat island effect mitigation, and flood control, natural hazards. Then there's the cultural values that people put in green space, aesthetics, educational value, recreation, and of course, last but not least, habitat for species. So the model that we then developed includes 7 systems: infiltration systems, rain gardens, ponds and lakes, green roofs, swales, tanks, and wetlands. And I'm not going to tell you in detail exactly how it works, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. So the first step is just to compile all the data that we need for all these factors that I mentioned. Then we're going to mask out regions where we can't do it. The third step is to basically relate all these raw data to a suitability value. So we need to know, actually I'm going to explain this on the next slide, so I'll skip over that for now. And then the last bit is just to combine all these different factors and create something that we can actually use for our planning, which is the suitability maps. So masking essentially is very easy. We just take out areas that have too much of a slope, for example, that are cultural heritage and for that reason cannot be altered, that are around airports, for example, so wetlands can't be placed around airports because of the attracting of birds, where there's already something that we don't really want to replace for WSUD. Okay, so the value scaling is basically translating, this is a map of slopes for a case study that we did in Darabin. So basically translating these slopes into a suitability value. So low slopes, green, high suitability, high slopes, red, low suitability. Just a value scaling step. We do this for each individual criterion so that we then can compare all these criteria to each other. And that's what we do in this step. So we take all these different criteria together, and I've got about 40 optional criteria, and of course which criteria you choose depends on the system that you're looking at and also the data that you have. And then you get an output like this, so that's a suitability map. Very easy to read, anyone can understand it, you don't need to have any knowledge. Green means yes, red means no, well, red means probably not, white means no. So we actually also did a little bit of testing. I'm not going to talk about that now because I don't have time, but we compared, this was done together with E2 Design Lab, which is a consultancy in Melbourne. We compared the placement of these kind of maps to prioritization studies that they did to see if they kind of align. And obviously they put a lot of time and effort in these studies. So to see if a tool like this can do the same thing basically in a matter of an hour. And yeah, results were pretty good. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of what it looks like at the moment. It's integrated into very commonly used spatial software that you might be familiar with, ArcGIS. And essentially it's just, this is the start page, so this is now set up in Melbourne. These are all the councils of Melbourne. And it basically appears on the top ribbon as a toolbar. So it's an edit. This is very dodgy, but that is the toolbar. I hope the other slides aren't this dodgy. So the first step, I'm just going to go step by step through the process of using the tool. So the first step is you select your area of interest. You can either just draw a square and it zooms into that square, or you select the council, which is what we're going to do here. We select Darabin Council, and we're going to zoom into Darabin Council. So that's the first step. Now the next step is we're going to select our system, and I realize that this is way too small. So these are the 7 systems that I showed you before in this drop-down list. So you select the system you want to look at, and then it does the masking for you, and all the white areas are the masked out areas. Third step is you do the suitability, the criteria weighting. So this is where actually the expertise of the user comes in. So they're going to weight all the criteria and evaluate how important these criteria are for them. So how important do you consider slope as compared to urban heat island mitigation, for example? And you're going to do this comparison for all the criteria. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. So you basically have like a pop-up window, and you can drag on a scale of 0 to 100, how important is a criterion to you, and this is relative to each other. So if you rate all the criteria 1, that's going to do the same if you rate all the criteria 50. It's just relative to one another. So once you've done that, you basically add the map, which looks like this, which you showed in the previous slide as well. You can also choose for some criteria that are like yes or no criteria. For example, overlays of sensitive areas, culturally sensitive areas. You can choose not to include them in the suitability calculation, but to have them as separate overlays, so you can actually exactly see where these areas are, which is what these black areas here are. So it's like cultural heritage areas. Then there's a number of things that you can do, and I specifically included this after the conversation I had with councils, because they told me what we need things that we can report on, we need numbers, we need figures, we need maps. And so what I did is I included summary statistics here, where you can, in a blink of an eye, you can see, okay, how suitable is my area? A few, easy numbers. So that's one thing you could do. Another thing is you can have a graph of suitability over the whole area, basically a histogram, and I'll show you that. So this is just a zoomed in map. These are the summary statistics, so it tells you, okay, my average suitability is this, my high suitability is this, my lowest suitability is that. Majority of my area has this suitability. And you can also see that in a histogram. And then finally, there's one function that I really like personally, which is the explain tool. So you can basically go to this map, click on anywhere, and you get an explanation of why it has the color that it has. So you click somewhere, you get this screen, it says, okay, the suitability here at this point is 61. The high suitability is, the highest criterion with the high suitability is this, so that's why. The lowest one is this. These are all the ones with their individual criteria, suitability per criterion, and it also tells you which criterion is the strongest pull to make it that value 61, basically. What's the most important criterion in that relation. How much do I have left?
You have 13 minutes. Oh, yeah. Including questions about minutes.
Okay, that's good. I don't have to speed up then. Alright, so one thing, that we did after this, so this is, you basically can play around with it, and the idea is that it's not going to tell you what to do, right? And I don't think that a tool or a model should tell you what to do. It is meant to, as was said in my introduction actually, it's meant to, for people to be able to analyze data, to visualize data, to get a feel of what are we looking at. But it's still up to the people to take the decision, because the tool's not going to actually tell you you have to do this or you have to do that. It can also help you start a debate, because if you fill out the tool with your criteria weightings and I fill out the tool with my criteria weightings, we will have different results. And this will spark a conversation, and we can say, okay, why is that area in your case suitable, in my area it's not suitable? It's like, oh, it must be this criterion because you rate that really highly, I rated it low. So it kind of gets you to interact with the data, basically, and get a better understanding. Now, this is something that I've done recently. It's where I've basically looked at, I've ran the model, this is Darwin case study again, I ran the model for all the systems, so 7 different types of systems. And I looked at, I took for every cell, so these maps are raster maps. For every raster cell, I looked what is the system that has the highest suitability value in this cell. So what is the best system in this place compared to all the other systems, essentially. And actually, I expected everything to be rain tanks, because rain tanks are very easy to implement anywhere. I expected the whole map to be, in this case, where rain tanks groups, gray. But to my surprise, it was actually not that bad. It was actually quite a diversity of best systems per location. And every single system out of these 7 systems was the best at certain locations. So that's another one. That's my time is over. So that was really a surprising result to me, and I was actually quite happy to see. That means that all the different systems that we have actually have their own benefit depending on the area where you implement them. And there's no one best solution, it really depends on the location. And yeah, this is just to illustrate that. So it's still rain tanks, yes, still the highest occurrence, but definitely not the only one. And okay, to close off, the next thing that we, or that I want to do is to migrate SSANTO. Now it's part of ArcGIS, which is a licensed software that not everyone has access to. So I want to make it an independent, standalone thing that you can just install on your computer and run it without having any other software. I'm currently doing studies in the Georges River catchment in Sydney to basically do the same as we did in Melbourne, create a database of all the systems that are there and relate them to the different factors, the same as I did in Melbourne, to see how we're doing in Sydney, or in Georges River catchment at least, and also run SSANTO for the Georges River catchment. And finally, Anna talked about urban beats this morning, so we're also integrating SSANTO into urban beats. That is it from me, so.
Wondering, so when you did the work in Darabin, did you kind of cross-check that with, say, what the stormwater engineers were thinking they would want to implement in those areas? Like, did it ring true?
Yeah, that's exactly the way that we tested it. So we looked at, in this case, this was done with E2 Design Lab, and so they did a big study prioritizing different locations for systems. And that was done with all these experts on board, basically. So it was an extensive study, and then we compared running SSANTO to the outcomes of that study. So basically, all these stars that I showed on that map, I don't know if you remember, all those stars were their priority locations. So basically, are those locations greener on my map than other locations? Yeah, which was the case. So that was promising. Yeah, promising.
So the follow-up question, presumably you took what the engineers, like their assumptions and weighting criteria, etc., for their analysis and put it into the tool. As part of the criteria, your multi-criteria, because it's multi-criteria analysis.
Yeah.
Understand of all the different layers, and so you're weighting them according to different, parameters or weights. And so where did your weights come from? Do they come from the E2 Design Lab kind of outcomes, and then you fed it into there?
Yeah, so there's two things that you do with the multi-criteria analysis. The one thing is the value scanning that I showed, so translating what does the slope of 2% mean for the implementation of a rain garden. In terms of suitability, that is something that I just use literature for, because this is basically science. We just know what is right, what is wrong. 2% means this for a rain garden.
So the E2 Design Lab would have to do that too?
No, they didn't have to do that. So those things are like hard-coded, as we call it. Then the weighting is something that the user does. So this is your preference. So it's basically saying, okay, we know that slope is this good for a rain garden, but how important do you find that compared to other things? And maybe you're willing to give up suitability in terms of slope because that location is super good in terms of urban heat island effect mitigation. So this basically trading off it's a preference thing, and it's not like science. It depends.
No, that's what I'm understanding, and so that's what I was wondering. I'm finding it amazing that you have a different set, a different group, the same values, because it's about the trade-offs that you're saying.
Yeah.
So did you come up with your own independent values, or did you get those considerations from that E2 Design Lab?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting question. I did both.
Yeah.
I did many things. I did first. I just gave every criterion the same value. Look what the results were there. Then I asked E2 Design Lab, the people basically who did the prioritization study, for them to do the weighting. And what I did then is use a technique called it's an automatic way of weighting criteria based on the information density. It's a little bit technical to explain it in detail right now, but it's basically an automatic weighting thing. Because if you have a criterion that is equal over the whole area, for example, if your slope is 0% everywhere, then slope can be still very important and you can weigh it really highly, but it won't have an effect on your outcome, right? So basically the information density of the data decides what the weight is going to be.
It has the variability of the actual data, so if there's
In
a lot of
your-
variance, it has a higher.
Exactly, yeah. And this has a name which I can't think of
I
now.
know.
Entropy weighting, that's the name. And very surprisingly, that performed better than the weighting done by the engineers.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
That-
And I have some
that machine
theories,
learning,
but-
that's what I was.
Yeah. I have some theories why this is the case, but I need to prove it.
It's learning from itself without
Yeah.
Yes.
I was just wondering who you see as the end user of the product. Is it, say, a developer when they're kind of trying to if they're responsible for developing a parcel of land and putting in some advisors as a council to kind of set the rules about what can go and where? Who do you see as being the last people using it?
I think councils would be the main user, or it would be most useful on this kind of scale of the council. Also because councils often may not have the capacity to do like very deep studies. They spend a lot of money asking consultants to do it for them. And I think if they have the opportunity to use something like this, they could do a lot of the work themselves in a much quicker way. And so I think that would be the main target audience. But also develop it is if it's a big development, but if it's a really small scale, then the variability is not going to be very big, so it won't tell you very much. Yeah, and it's not a design tool. It's really a planning tool. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes. Just wondering what the resolution is. How does that translate into?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The resolution really depends on the data that you have. Because if all your data has a resolution of 100 by 100 and you're going to give results in 20 by 20, obviously that's not going to.
Yeah, and you have so many layers.
Yeah,
How do you
yeah.
feel about that?
So it's a user setting, and there's also a default. And the default is just like the lowest resolution that you have as an input, so that you don't lose any data. But it is possible. You can choose as a user what you want.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. So I ask you to join me in thanking Martin for his presentation.